Hello everyone. In this episode I want to spend a little time talking about form validation. Form validation doesn't really introduce anything new. We're basically just going to, when doing form validation, continue using some of the tools that we've picked up in some of our previous episodes. Primarily, form validation is going to deal with the DOM being able to access data mostly from inside forms, and it's going to deal with events to a certain, rather limited, I guess you'd say, extent. Anyway, the idea behind form validation is that bandwidth is expensive. Anytime a form is submitted to a website that is incomplete, and that website then on the server discovers that all of the information that it needs to complete the request is not present, the server then has to take and send that page back to the user. So what's happened is we've had a page submitted, we've had some processor time used, and we've had a page returned, and basically the website's gotten absolutely nothing from it. It's all just been handling errors. So what we can do with JavaScript is we can actually have JavaScript step in at the point that the user attempts to submit a form, and then to have the JavaScript try to confirm or validate that the form has the necessary information contained in it for it to be worth actually submitting to the web server. If the JavaScript finds that the form is lacking in some way, then it can stop the submission from occurring, so there's no submission going to the server, there's no wasted server time while it validates the form, and then there's no wasted bandwidth as the page has to be sent back in order for the user to be able to complete it. So form validation is really sort of all about the efficiency of having data submitted to our websites, and it tends to be one of the more common sort of serious type jobs that JavaScript often has to be responsible for, which is one of the reasons that I'm drawing it out here and talking about it in its own particular little episode. You can see what I actually have here is a little form that I've put together. I have this form currently submitting to a page on my student website, an echo page, which basically will just show us what data is submitted by the form. The form's data is being submitted through the post method. And what I actually then have in the form is I have a nickname field, I have an email address field, right? Both of those text fields, and then I have a field for account type, just sort of a make-believe field. Imagine that we were going to let the user choose what type of account they want. So when I take this form and I pull it up in my browser, it looks basically like this. If I go and then fill in some information in it, for example, here we go, test@test.com, and let's say a premium account. When I choose to register, you can see it actually submits and the different pieces of data are being received by the server. There's NOAA for the nickname, premium for the account type, and test@test.com for the email address. Now the way this form currently works, being basically just HTML, is if the form is complete or not complete, it submits the same way. So here, even if the form were left completely empty, I can hit register and all of the data is submitted to the server. You can see that nickname, type, and email address are all actually blank in that case. And that's the kind of situation that we basically want to use our JavaScript to avoid having the bandwidth to and from the server wasted, and avoid having the server's time wasted by an incomplete form submission. So when we want to have JavaScript do form validation for us, the first question becomes, how do we get JavaScript tied into this basic action that's taking place here inside the browser? Well, there's actually a few different ways that we can do this, but before I jump right into that, let's go ahead and kind of set ourselves a little goal. What I'm going to do up here in the head section of my document is I'm going to put in a set of script tags, and inside these script tags I'm going to create a validate function. This validate function is basically the function that I'm going to eventually have actually go through the form and make sure that it's as complete as it can be. For the time being, I'm going to just put an alert in there that says validating, so that we can tell if it's executing or not. Now, of course, at the moment, that function is really in no way related to the form, so if I were to pull the page up now and submit, we would not see that function execute at all. So how do we actually get that function to execute at the time that the user clicks the submit button, but before the browser actually marshals the data and sends it to the server? There's a few different techniques we can use. Let me show you the one that I like least first. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to copy my submit button that I already have. I'm going to comment out the original one. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to turn this from being an actual submit button into being just a regular old button, and I'm going to give this button an ID. All right, I'll call it submit button. All right. One of the ways that I could actually get the function to execute before the form is submitted is that I could, up here in my head section, inside the window.onload event, okay, I could go ahead and retrieve that button by using document.getElementById like we've done previously. It's called submit button. There we go. And then what I could do is I could actually put in an on-click behavior for that button, where whenever that button's clicked, what it does is it calls the validate function. Oops, something like that. Just assign the function itself to the on-click. So now if I go back over to my browser and hit refresh, my button still looks exactly the same, but when I click it now, you can see what it actually does is instead of submitting the form, what it does instead is it calls my function. It would be that function's job at that point to actually go through and determine whether that form is complete or not. What we could actually do at that point is we could use some other events of the, or some other methods that are present in the DOM to decide whether to actually submit or not. For example, if we were to go through that validate function and we were to find that the form was complete, was ready to be submitted, then what we could do is something like document.form0, meaning of course the first form on the page, and then we find that forms actually have a submit function, so we could do something along those lines where it would first perform whatever validating action we want, and then if the validating action comes back successful, we could have JavaScript sort of programmatically submit the form. And we take a look at that in our browser. If I hit register now, you can see the alert pops up, which is of course the substitute for where I would actually be doing my validation. Right? And as soon as I hit OK, it goes ahead and actually submits. In that case, it's JavaScript ordering the document to actually submit. So one way or another, this works. This is certainly a possibility. The problem that I tend to have with this particular technique, though, is that if JavaScript is turned off in the user's browser, then it's going to effectively render our button down here unusable for the most part. So having our form set up this particular way will work just fine in perfect situations, sort of in a perfect environment. But if somebody has JavaScript turned off, then it basically won't work at all. There will be no way for them to actually be able to submit that form using the submit button. So, like I said, this is not my favorite way to go with this type of thing. What I prefer instead is to just keep a regular old submit button, just like you would put at the bottom of any form. That way, if JavaScript is turned off, we will still have a submittable form, a form that the user can still submit. But then the question becomes, how do we then tie that into sort of the browser's response to them? How do we get our JavaScript to execute at the point where the browser actually clicks the submit button? And it turns out it's actually a pretty easy thing to do. Still here inside the window.onload function, what I could do is I could go to document.forms element 0, first form on the page, and we can discover here that forms actually have an onSubmit event that can be used. So we can actually assign to the onSubmit event our validate function, something like this. All right. If we take a look at that in the browser now, when I hit the register button, you can see that still my JavaScript is executing, right? The way it's set up right now, the form is also automatically submitting. So basically what happens is that whenever we click the submit button, that triggers the onSubmit behavior of the form. The onSubmit behavior of the form, sort of like hyperlinks that we talked about previously, can have both a JavaScript component to it, which is basically the validate function that I'm asking it to run here, but it also has its own default behavior, which is the actual submission of the form. And what the browser will do is it will actually run the JavaScript part of onSubmit first, and then it will look for a value being returned from that. If the value being returned from that is missing or true, then what will actually happen is the browser will go ahead and do its default behavior, meaning it'll go ahead and submit the form. But if it finds that the validate function returns a value of false, so if I come back up here to my validate function and return false, for example, okay, then it will not execute its default behavior, sort of the same way that we previously used a confirm function to decide whether to follow a hyperlink or not. So let's take a look at that now. If I hit register, my JavaScript executes, and then that's it. Because of the false value that's being returned from the validate function, the form did not automatically submit. So what we would want to do in this case is we would want our validate function to actually go through, determine whether the form is complete enough to submit, and if it is, it would return true. But if it finds that the form is incomplete in some way, then it would return false, and then the form would not submit. Now that we have our JavaScript tied into the onSubmit behavior of our form, we can go on and talk about the actual validation itself. The first thing I'm going to do is just clean out some of those comments that I'd put in here from the less desirable of the two techniques that I showed you there a minute ago. What we want to do now is we basically want to come back up to our validate function and see if we can actually make it do some work, do the actual work of validating our form. Let's take a real quick look here at the form itself and just familiarize ourselves with what we have to work with and what rules we're going to try to follow. For starters, we have a text field where the user is supposed to type in their nickname. This field is called nickname, so that's the name that we're going to be dealing with. That text field should not be allowed to be blank if the form is going to submit, or at least we're going to say that's going to be the rule for it. We also then have an email address field whose name is email address with an underscore between email and an address. It's again a text field, and we are going to again want to make sure that that field is not blank whenever the form is submittable. And then lastly, we have this select component. It's called type. What type actually has available in it is 3 different option tags. The first of the 3 option tags is blank. The blank option tag is sort of the default, the idea being that we sort of want to force the user to choose one of the other two. So kind of like with the 2 text fields, we don't want to allow the form to submit if the blank option here is the one that's selected. We want to make sure that they've selected either premium or standard. So back up in my validate function then, I'm not going to need my alert anymore. Instead, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to go through here and have my validate function check each one of the different fields in my form, in this case 3 different fields. There's a few different ways that I can do this. I'm going to do it sort of the more straightforward standard manual way here this first time. But while the validate function is validating the form, there's a few extra sort of pieces of work that are also going to need to be done. It's of course going to overall need to keep track of whether the form is complete enough to submit or not. But as sort of a secondary thing, it's also going to need to keep track of what problems it finds with the form. Essentially, if it does find problems with the form, what are those problems? Because as you can imagine, if the form doesn't submit, we would actually want to somehow notify the user that there was a problem with the form, tell them specifically what the problems were. We wouldn't want them just sitting there clicking the submit button, having it not submit and not know why. People would just assume that the form was broken at that point. So the way I'm going to go about this here is I'm going to create myself an errors variable. I think I got one too many R's in there. There we go. Which I'm going to initialize to an empty string. And the way I'm actually going to have this work then is as I go through and check all of the different fields, anytime I find a field with a problem, I'm going to take the sort of description of that problem and I'm going to append it here to the errors variable. Because what that will then allow me to do is at the end I can say if errors, too many R's again, I can say if errors is equal to blank, meaning we found no errors, then I can return true. Otherwise, I can return false. So that will be sort of the final check that happens here inside the validation function. We start off with errors blank. If we then go through, check all of our fields and find no problems, then by the time we get down here, the errors variable will still be blank, in which case we'll return true, which will cause the form to submit. But if we start off with a blank errors variable, and then when we go through and we check the form, we do find problems, we append the description of those problems to our errors variable, then when we get down here to the bottom, we'll find that the errors variable is not blank, in which case we will return false and the form will not submit. Let me also go ahead and throw in here an alert where I'll just show the errors so we can see if our errors are being kept track of the way that they should. Right. Now in this first sort of validation technique I want to show you, I mentioned to you that it's sort of a very manual way of doing it. Right. What I'm actually going to want to do here in this part of the validate function is simply using control structures, go through each one of the different fields individually and determine whether it is complete or not according to whatever rules I've decided to follow. So I could start off by doing something like saying if document.forms element 0 dot nickname, which means that I'm checking the field called nickname that's inside the first form on the page. If that particular field's value is equal to a blank, then that would be a problem. So what I would do then is to my errors variable, I would append something like you must give your nickname, nuckname. I like nuckname better. We'll go with nickname anyway, something along those lines. I'm also going to throw a \n there on the end of that string. The \n means new line, which most of the time in JavaScript isn't really going to show us or do anything special for us. But when we actually take these errors and we display them down here in this alert, that new line will actually work, so each one of these separate errors will appear on its own separate line in the alert that pops up. But that would pretty much be it. That would take care of our nickname for us. If there were any other kinds of checks that we needed to perform, like if the nickname had to be more than a certain number of characters, we could go ahead and do those same checks in additional if statements there. Right? Next, what I'm going to do is inside document.forms element 0 dot email address, I'm going to check that field's value, and if that one's value is blank, then I'm going to want to do basically the same thing. To my errors variable, I'm going to append you must give your email address. And a new line. Oops. Where am I? There we go. All right, the only thing left for me to then check is the drop-down box, the select component. Now the select component is a little bit different because we're not simply dealing with just a regular old value and string like we were with the text fields. Instead, with the select component, what we are going to want to deal with is, well, there is actually a value attribute that we could use. So now that I think about it, we could do it pretty much that same way. But I wanted to show you something about a select that's a little bit different, and that is called the selected index. Let me just do this for right now. Let me put an alert and let me do document dot forms element 0 dot type. That type there should be the type as the name of my select component right here, type. Right. I just realized that might be a reserved word, so that might potentially give me a problem. We'll have to come back and see. Right? After type, let me then put in selected index. There we go. What that should actually do, what selected index should do, is it should treat all of the different options inside that select component sort of like they were an array, and come back and give me the element number of the one that's currently selected. So let's just go try that over here in our browser real quick and see how that goes. If I click register, okay, there's the 0. What that actually is meaning is that what's currently selected in my select component is element 0, or essentially the first option tag. And then there's my errors that go along with my nickname and my email address field, and then you see that the form doesn't submit. If I come over to my account type select and I pick, let's say, standard, you'll see that standard is actually the third option tag. So if the first one is element 0, the second is element 1, and this one then should be element 2. So what we should see pop up in the very first alert now should be 2. And sure enough, there it goes. So what we can do with that selected index is it kind of gives us an alternate way of being able to check the values that go along with select components. So I could, for example, say if the selected index of my type is equal to 0, meaning it's the blank option, then I could go ahead and make myself an error and say you must choose an account type, or something like that. All right, and then that would pretty much be it. If I come back over and take a look at it in my browser again, if I put in a nickname and I choose a type, but I leave out the email address, you can see that I get an error message saying you must get your email address, and the form doesn't submit. If I leave out the nickname and put in an email address, select an account type, then I get an error about the nickname. If I don't choose my account type, but I give all the other information, can't spell my own name, then I just get the error about the account type. And then finally, if I actually do choose or select values for all three and I hit register, no error messages and the form submits just like it should. Okay, with that taken care of, what I wanted to go on and show you next then is sort of an alternate way that we could go through and do form validation. It might be a little bit easier in some cases, it might be a little bit harder in others. It all just sort of depends on the situation. One way or another, it is a pretty decent technique that we could use. What we have right now, as you've seen, certainly does work, but also keep in mind that this form we're dealing with here is only 3 fields long. Now, usually it is a pretty good idea to try to keep your forms fairly short and concise so they don't intimidate somebody who has to fill them out. But nevertheless, just a 3-field form is fairly short. If we were collecting an address, a billing address, a shipping address, all of that information, the form would be considerably longer, which means the number of if statements that we would have up here in our validate function would also be considerably more numerous. We would have a lot more work to do to validate a longer field or a longer form using this sort of very manual technique. So what I wanted to show you now was kind of a different way that we could go through and do basically the same work, but in a way that might be a little bit more automated. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of those if statements that I put in before, and what I want to do up here instead is I want to put in a loop that will automatically take me through all the different parts of the form. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go with a for loop where I'm going to create a variable called x. I'm going to initialize it to 0, and I'm going to say that as long as x is less than document.forms element 0 dot elements dot length. Now elements is a subarray inside the forms array that has within it all of the different form controls, basically all of the different fields. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying start at field 0 and keep going to the length of the fields. However many fields there are, go that far, basically is what I'm saying. All right. I'll do an x++, so what we end up with here is a for loop that will one at a time take us through each one of the separate controls that are actually present in the form. Just to kind of show you, let me throw an alert in here, and let me alert for you document.forms element 0 dot elements, elements x, right? So that'll take us through each one individually. And then let me put in .type there. We're actually going to look at the type of each one of those different elements. If I come over and look at that in my browser now, when I actually hit submit, it says it found a text field, another text field, a select one component, which is what JavaScript calls a regular select component. If on that select component we had set multiple equal to multiple as an HTML attribute, then that would come up as select multiple, but just select one as the way it is right now. And then it finds our submit button. So you can see there that it actually goes through and it finds and is able to discern the type of each one of the separate elements that it actually finds in the document. So the way we could use that is here inside the for loop, we could do something like say, if the type of the element is text, okay, then perform some type of test on it. So this would allow us to have sort of a generic test that could be performed on all of the fields of a specific type. Right? We could have another if statement in here where we say if the type is a select one, right? Ooh, that should be a hyphen, not an underscore, right? Then perform some other type of test on it. So if we had a form that had a dozen different text fields on it, instead of having to have an if statement for each one, I could have sort of a generic test like what I have here that would perform the same basic test on all of the different fields. And like I said before, this might be easier, this might be harder. It really kind of all depends on the form. If our form has a lot of text fields, for example, in it, and they all need to be treated with basically the same rules, then doing it this way would be much easier than going through and doing each one of them individually and just repeating the same test, the same code over and over again for each one of those separate fields. But if our form has a bunch of text fields where each one has different rules that has to be followed, then something like this might actually end up being more difficult. But nevertheless, let's just see what we could go ahead and do with this. At this point, we've checked to see if that particular element is a text field. If it is a text field, then what we would want to do next is check to see, let's say, if it's blank. So I could say if document.forms element 0 dot elements x, if that particular field's value is equal to blank, okay, then in that case we have a problem. So what I need to do is add something to my errors variable at that point. So I could do something like, say, the something, I'll just put there temporarily, field cannot be blank. Yeah, and a new line at the end. So I'm still going to put together basically an error message. The question is, how do I customize the error message per field? I don't want it to say the text field cannot be blank, because of course the form might have lots of different text fields on it. So what I could do right here, where I actually need the name of the field, is I could actually use the name of the field. I could do something like document.forms element 0 dot elements x dot name. So I actually take the name of the field and I append it in there along with everything else. So if I was going to do something like this, I would want to make sure that the different fields in my form actually have sensible names, something that would make sense to the user. Let's see how that works. If I go ahead and submit now, you can see it says the nickname field cannot be blank, where nickname was actually the name of the field that was extracted from the field itself. It says the email address field cannot be blank, where email address was actually the name of the field that it's extracted from the field itself. So that works just fine. That actually works out real well. You can see we're checking both of our different text fields there with the same little bit of logic, or the same little bit of code. And if I had 12 other text fields in this form that also needed just to be checked for completeness, checked to make sure that they weren't blank, this same little set of if statements right here would be able to take care of all of them for us. Okay. Coming down and working with the select component then would be basically the same idea. If we find a select component, then I could simply say if document.forms element 0 dot elements x dot selected index, if it's equal to 0, then we'll call that a problem, and we will do basically the same sort of error message that we had up here. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to copy and paste it. There we go. Except maybe I should change the message a little bit. It's right now going to say the type field cannot be blank. I don't know, I guess that makes sense. So we can stick with that. Back over in the browser now, I submit, and sure enough, everything looks just the way it should, but we're having our checking done for us in a slightly more automated fashion. Okay. Go through and try filling in some of the different fields, make sure everything works the way it should, and if everything is complete, okay, the form submits. So it looks like another winning solution, another way that we can actually go through and do the form validation itself. One of the last things I'd like to talk about as far as our form validation solution goes here is actually the way that we're displaying the error messages. Right now the validation is certainly happening. Everything is in essence functioning the way that it should, but it's just not very elegant the way that it is. Right now we're actually taking any errors that occur and having them shown in an alert box. And what you'll tend to find is that users of the web generally don't trust alert boxes too much. We've been stung for too many years by pop-ups that we don't want. People don't read them. Often they're scared to even click on them. They just start shutting their browser down when they see them. So it's typically best to avoid those alerts in any kind of real situation where the user may see them. But if we get rid of the alerts, how are we actually then going to show the error messages to the user? Well, what I would actually say is that we could go ahead and keep the errors, right? But what we could do is, instead of popping them up in an alert, maybe we could actually take them and make them a part of the page itself. I think what I might do in order to make this work a little bit easier is, instead of having my errors variable just be a string, I'm actually going to turn it into an array. something like that. And then every time there's an error, instead of appending it to the string, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push it onto the array. All right. So push there. Push, of course, I think we've talked about previously. It's just going to more or less append. That should be push. Append that piece of data as a new element onto the array. So there we go. We end up pushing everything onto the array. Down here for our error checking at the end, where previously we were checking to see if the string was blank, what we could do now is we could say if the length of the array is equal to 0, meaning that no errors were added to it, then go ahead and submit the form. Otherwise, okay, we're not going to show it as an array there. We'll do something else with it. Otherwise, we'll return false, right, and not submit the form. So with all of those errors stored in the array, what I could do here is I could either write in some code or maybe call another function to keep it a little bit cleaner that will actually display those errors to the user on the page itself. To make that a little bit easier, I'm going to actually come down here to the page itself, and I'm going to put in a div down here. I'm going to call it the errors div. Right? And what I want to do is I actually want to have JavaScript insert into that div all of the individual error messages that may be there inside the errors array. What I'll do is I think I'm going to call a function. I'm going to call it show errors. All right? And maybe I'll pass it that errors array. Then let me just write that show errors function right in here. And I'm going to say it's going to be passed an array. I'll just call it array. Maybe I'll call it errors like I did before. Yeah, I'll just call it errors. Same basic name I had before. I don't think that'll be too confusing. Okay, so here inside this function then, I want to have it go through and take each one of the individual elements of that array, turn it into a text node, put that text node into a paragraph, and put that paragraph into the div that's a part of our page. So I'm going to start by just retrieving the div itself, since I'm going to need it throughout the rest of this function. So I'm going to do a get element by ID, retrieve the thing called errors, which is the div down there, right? And then I'm going to start a for loop. For loop, I'm going to make a variable called x. As long as x is less than the length of the errors array, then I will increment x as we go through all the different elements of the array. As we go through each of the elements of the array, I'm going to take the actual error from that element of the array and turn it into a text node. So I'm going to do a document.create text node. Right? And the actual text I'm going to put in it is going to be the text from that particular element of the array. So that gives me my text node. Next thing I'll do then is I'll create a paragraph. So I'm going to do a document.create element. And I want to create a paragraph. Oops. There we go. I want to take the actual text node, the error itself, and put it into the paragraph. So I'm going to do a p.append child error. So put the error into the paragraph. And then the last thing I would then need to do is I would need to take that paragraph and put it into the div. So I'll do div.append child p. Something like that. All right. Let's take a look at it in the browser and see if that works. Right? If I try to register now, there we go. I get all of my errors showing up right there as page content, so the user can still see all the errors and they can see it without having to use an alert. I could of course use a little CSS in there to kind of style that up. Up here in my head section I could put in some style tags and say for the errors div set the color to red, let's say. And I try to submit again. There we go. And that's it. If I try to submit a second time, you can see that every time I submit, right, it just keeps adding on to that errors div until eventually the page is reloaded. So one other thing I could do in here to make this work a little bit better would be to actually clear all the errors out of the div before I try to display any new errors in it. The idea being that if there is a problem with their email address, let's say they put in their name and their account type, right? Then I get an email address error. But let's say for whatever reason they at that point go back and erase their name but put in their email address. If they hit register again, they still get the email address error is still showing up there, so that it might be a little bit confusing. So it'd really be better if we cleaned out all those errors before we showed a new batch of errors, so the user's only seeing what's current at any one particular time. So to clear out old errors, what I'll do here is just before I call the show errors function, I'm going to call clear errors, another function that I'm going to make up. All right. Here's the clear errors function. Right. It's going to retrieve the errors div the same way that the show errors function did, but what I want to do here is I want to go through and basically empty everything out of it. So what I'm going to actually do here is I'm going to put together a while loop. For the while loop, I'm going to say while div dot, and now I have to remember the name of this function, has children, maybe. Okay, while div dot has children, then div dot remove child, div dot first child. Boy, that doesn't seem right at all. I don't know. Let's see what happens. Reload the page, hit register again. Yeah, that's definitely not working. I don't think I'm remembering the names of all of my functions the way I should. Let's see. We're actually not getting any errors, though. That's kind of peculiar. Very interesting. I am calling clear errors. This is my clear errors function. Let me throw an alert in here. Clearing errors, just to make sure that this function is actually getting called. Yep, it says it's clearing the errors. So there simply must be something wrong with what I'm doing down here. Let's see. Okay, I think I remember what I needed. What I need here for my function is a function called hasChildNodes. I think that's what I did wrong. The hasChildNodes function should return true or false, depending on whether there's actually any children, any other nodes, any other elements inside this div. If there are, then that's when we'll try to remove the children, the first child, and keep removing the first child until there are no more child nodes. Let's see if that works. So I try to register. Clearing errors. There's my 3 errors. I try to register again. Still just 3. There we go. So that seems to have cleaned it up. I can take this alert out now. And if I take a look at it, if I put in a nickname, no email address, and select an account type, I get an email address error. If I then take out the nickname and put in an email address, I only get the nickname error. So that cleans that up very, very nicely. The one other thing that we might do with this little bit of form validation and making sure that the user is clear about exactly what's wrong with the form is, in addition to actually showing them the error message here on the page like we're doing, which is pretty effective by itself, it might also be nice if we could actually mark the field somehow so that they could sort of have a visual indicator of what fields it is they need to pay attention to. Maybe, for example, if a field had a problem, we could set that field's background color to red. That would be a fairly easy thing to do as well. Up here inside the form validation part of our validate function, whenever we find a field that seems to be an error, in addition to actually creating an error message in the errors array for it for later display, what we could also do at that point is we could go ahead and manipulate its CSS properties to make it visually distinct from other fields that don't have any errors. So I'm going to do document.forms element 0 elements x dot, let's see, that's the one we want. So dot style, let's do dot background color. And let's set it to, let's say red. All right. And then let me do the exact same thing right down here. All right, let's see how that works. All right, so now if I submit my form, not only do I get my red errors, but I also get the fields themselves turning red. If I put in a nickname, oh, it stays red. Let me reload the page here, right? If I actually had in a nickname and let's say I selected an account type and then submitted, right, it not only tells me that there's an email address error, but it also highlights the email address field for me. So that works real well too. One other thing that we could do to clean that up a little bit is I really don't like having the CSS color here inside the JavaScript all that much. And since we already have a section down here for CSS, I've already put in a set of style tags. What I could do, for example, would be to put in maybe a class called inError, where I could then set the background color to red or whatever color I actually want. And then what I could do with my JavaScript is I could actually have it assign that class to anything that it finds that's an error. That way I don't have to have the actual CSS setting of the color in up here. Instead, whenever I find an element that has a problem, I could just set its class name attribute equal to inError, like that. So it keeps my JavaScript and my CSS a little more separate and distinct that way. And let's go see if that works all right. Reload. Let's put in an email and select an account type. And sure enough, you see we still get the red background color, and it'll be a little bit more maintainable, because if I decide I don't want a red background, I instead want a yellow background, for example, then I can just make the change in my CSS where that kind of thing belongs. And then when I see it back in my browser again, there you go. You can see I get that yellow color. So things are a little bit more separate and working a bit better that way. The only other thing I wanted to mention to you about doing form validation with JavaScript is that JavaScript can't do all types of validation. There are some types of validation where JavaScript just simply doesn't have access to the data it needs to be able to validate everything about a form. For example, here with this form, in addition to making sure that the user provides a nickname and an email address when they register, we might also want to make sure that that nickname hasn't already been used. If it was going to be used, for example, as a login name, we would need to make sure that was unique. Well, JavaScript doesn't have access to all of the different nicknames that are stored in our database from previous registrations, so there really isn't much of a convenient way anyway, that JavaScript could do that validation for us. Same sort of thing here with the email address. If somebody's already registered using that email address, right, we would expect the email address to always be unique, and JavaScript could not perform that type of validation. So JavaScript is always going to be sort of the front line in validation, but there's also going to be validation that later will have to be performed on the server. But JavaScript is a good start and should be used whenever you want to save the trouble of having forms submitted that may not actually be complete.